All right, let's dive into a question that has been at the heart of some of the biggest debates in history. Are our destinies already written? Today, we're going to trace the story of one explosive idea, sovereign predestination, from its fiery beginnings in the Reformation all the way to its pretty dramatic unraveling. It's a journey that, believe it or not, still echoes today. Let's get into it. So here's our roadmap. We'll kick things off with the central puzzle that got this whole thing started. Then we'll look at two totally different ways of solving it: the Lutherans' cautious, paradoxical approach and the bold, logical system of the Reformed. From there, we'll watch the whole idea reach its peak and then collapse in Geneva. And finally, we'll tie it all together and see why this centuries-old argument is still so important. To really get what's going on, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the Reformers. You have to understand the one core question that was keeping them up at night. And this is the question that changes everything. I mean, think about it. If God is truly all-powerful, if he's in control of everything, does that include our salvation? Is it really our choice? Or was the decision made for us before time even began? This single question is the key to unlocking the entire Reformation. Now, the most logical, and for a lot of people, the most terrifying answer to that question is a concept called double predestination. It's this idea that God's sovereign choice isn't just about who he saves, but also about who he actively chooses for damnation. This is the idea that would shake the very foundations of the church. So our first stop on this journey is Wittenberg. This was the epicenter of the Lutheran movement, and it's where they really grappled with this idea, not just as a theory, but as something that affected real people. Their approach was all about paradox and careful compromise. You gotta understand, for Martin Luther, this was not some abstract theological game. He was a pastor at heart. He saw the very real danger of people getting lost, spiraling into despair, trying to figure out God's secret hidden plans. So while he absolutely believed in God's total sovereignty, he constantly pointed people back to the revealed God, the God you meet in Jesus. For Luther, predestination was supposed to be a source of comfort, a guarantee of God's unshakable love, not a reason to be afraid. But here's where we start to see a small but really important shift. Luther's right-hand man, Philip Melanchthon, was more of a systematic thinker, and he was really worried about one key criticism. Hey, if God chooses everything, doesn't that make him the author of sin? To get around this, Melanchthon started putting a bit more emphasis on human responsibility in a way Luther never really did, and right there he planted the seeds for a totally different path. Well, these two different ways of thinking couldn't just coexist forever. The Lutherans needed an official answer, so in 1577, they hammered out this big compromise called the Formula of Concord. And what this document did was try to thread an incredibly difficult needle, creating what we now call single predestination. So how did they pull it off? It was actually pretty clever. They drew a sharp line between God's predestination and his foreknowledge. Here's the idea. God actively chooses and predestines the elect for salvation. That's an act of his will. But for those who are lost, God doesn't actively choose them for damnation. He simply knows, ahead of time, that they will freely choose to reject him. See the difference? It's subtle, but it's huge. It keeps God's grace at the center of salvation, while putting the blame for damnation squarely on human sin. Okay, so while the Lutherans are busy building this careful compromise, a much more radical and logically consistent view was taking shape over in Geneva. And the man behind it was, of course, John Calvin. His entire approach was driven by what he saw in Scripture, by relentless logic, and by this profound sense of awe before a totally sovereign God. And please, don't make the mistake of thinking Calvin's logic made him cold or unfeeling. This quote right here shows us something profound. He found the idea of reprobation, that God chooses not to save some people, to be a horrible decree. He didn't delight in it, but because he was convinced the Bible taught it, he felt he had no choice but to accept it. Not with joy, but with what he called stupendous awe. So how did Calvin deal with that same accusation that worried Melanchthon, that this whole system makes God the author of sin? He came up with a really critical distinction. He argued that, yeah, the ultimate cause of damnation is God's mysterious sovereign will. But, he said, the proximate or immediate cause is always our own voluntary sin. In his system, we are 100% responsible for our own rebellion, even if that rebellion is happening inside of God's bigger sovereign plan. Now, this commitment to logic led to some incredibly deep, almost mind-bending internal debates.
For instance, theologians started arguing about the logical order of God's eternal decrees. Think about this. Did God decide who to save and who to pass over before or after he decided to allow humanity to fall into sin? I know, it's a wild question, but it just goes to show how far they were willing to follow the logic of their system.
And that brings us to the final chapter of our story. We're standing right here in Geneva, the very fortress of Reformed theology, to watch as this incredibly detailed, intricate system begins to, well, come apart at the seams. This change didn't happen overnight. It was more like a slow erosion. You start with guys like Francis Turretin, fiercely defending the old, strict orthodoxy. But then, a contemporary of his, Louis Tronchin, starts to introduce a slightly softer view. The real domino, though, falls when Turretin's own son, Jean-Alphonse, gets rid of the rule that said ministers had to subscribe to the old confessions of faith. That one move basically opened the floodgates. It allowed a new generation, people like Jacob Vernet, to start blending Christian theology with the new, fashionable ideas of the Enlightenment. And the result was nothing short of a theological revolution. I mean, by the mid-1700s, the French philosopher d'Alembert could look at Geneva and cheekily remark that the pastors in John Calvin's own city had embraced a perfect Socinianism, which was a theology that denied core Christian beliefs like the divinity of Christ. And just a couple of generations, the fortress of orthodoxy had crumbled completely from the inside out. So, what's the point? What's the big takeaway from this epic story of an idea's rise and fall? Well, this history isn't just about the past. It actually reveals these deep, underlying tensions that are still very much playing out in theology today. Takeaway number 1. The biggest intellectual problem was always that same question. How do you have a God who is in control of everything without making him responsible for evil? Both the Lutherans and the Reformed came up with different answers, but every single solution involved trying to separate God's ultimate, sovereign decree from our immediate, personal responsibility for the choices we make. Second, that Lutheran attempt to find a middle ground, well, it created its own set of problems. See, by saying that humans are totally depraved and unable to save themselves, but then denying that God decrees who is lost, they created a kind of theological paradox. And the argument is that this built-in tension made their position inherently unstable, often causing later generations to drift away from that original view. And finally, we get a super practical, almost stark, lesson from what happened in Geneva. The minute J.A. Turretin got rid of the requirement for ministers to sign on to a common confession of faith, the doctrinal guardrails just fell away. That one administrative decision turned out to be the critical moment that opened the door for a complete and total theological overhaul. Which leaves us with a question that echoes way beyond the 16th century. The story of predestination is a story of evolution, fierce debate, and in some cases, decline. And it forces all of us to ask, where do you draw the line? Where is the line between healthy, necessary theological development and just abandoning the core of what you believe? It's a question Geneva had to answer, and it's a question we're all still grappling with today.